Hey again, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Discussions of Darkness. This week, I wanted to talk about something that we run into a lot as storytellers, and it can be a problem for any sort of long-term game if you want to keep your players invested and if you don't want your plot to get predictable. But to really hammer home what I'm talking about, I need to jump systems and settings for a moment, because I'm assuming we're all fans of tabletop RPGs, and it means most of us have played more than just the world or Chronicles of Darkness. So I want to take a moment to talk about my experience as a Pathfinder player and how this sort of relates to today's topic. For those of you out there who have not played Pathfinder, it was sort of the successor to Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition when it bombed really badly, and it's still one of the major fantasy RPGs that we have available today. And they have what are called adventure paths. Adventure paths are pre-written games that go from level 1 to usually around level 16 or 17. And each of them has a sort of list of threats, problems, escalations that you're going to have to deal with. And almost every one of them, in my experience as a player, I have not played all of them, but I have gone through my share, use the same tactic and tool to sort of up the stakes, up the ante, and make things more dramatic as the game goes on. And that is that usually, by the time you end up getting to the final part of the game and the final part of the challenge, you're fighting a lot of spellcasters. Because when it's a party of 5 to 6 individuals versus one target or a small handful of targets, magic is really the only way you have to even that playing field and to keep things dramatic. As a result, though, if you go into this game as a player, you know you're going to have to deal with that as a threat. It's something that is coming, and you're going to have countermeasures for it. It almost sucks the drama out of having evil necromancers, lich lords, resurrected rune lords for those who played that game, because you know, even if you don't know the specific form the end boss is going to take, you may not know their name, you may not know their particular school of magic, you may not know exactly what their motivation is, you know the weapon they're going to be wielding and you know the tools they're going to have, which means that you are already planning countermeasures early on in the game, which can sort of make things feel a little too mechanical. The world in Chronicles of Darkness often has the same problem, but rather than being because that's how the storytellers wrote it, it's how the person who's running the game at our table tends to make the same mistake over and over and over again. And this is something that I told myself I wouldn't do, and I fell into the trap, so it's a thing that can sneak up on you even if you tell yourself you're a better storyteller than this. But generally speaking, when you're playing a World or Chronicles of Darkness game, every single game has a quote-unquote big threat. If you're playing in Mage, it's I believe it's the Seers of the Throne is the name of the faction. If you're playing in Vampire, it's the Elders who have been asleep. If you're playing in Changeling, it's all of the True Fae and their various minions. If you're playing Werewolf the Apocalypse, it's the Worm and all the things that are corrupting the world. Every game has their go-to bad guy. And usually there's some variety of large existential threat connected to them, even if this threat is not really interested in destroying the world, it's not really interested in upending the order that you have all done your best to put back together. It's a threat to you and to people like you. And too often, we as storytellers will see there's this big threat, there's this big bad guy that's made just for this game, just for the types of supernatural characters that we have at the table, and we just immediately reach for that anytime that we need to up the stakes or we need to make players feel that they're being threatened. And you can do that once. Guaranteed, you can do it once, everyone's going to freak out, everyone's going to get really worried. If you start reaching into that bucket more and more, it's very similar to the old trope of horror movies of the monster's less scary the more of it you see. These things are our horror movie monsters. These are the things that the supernatural creatures our players are playing have nightmares about. These are the things they're genuinely afraid of, or at least they're supposed to be genuinely afraid of. But it's really hard to maintain that kind of tension when you have fought members of this faction, when you have dealt with these monsters, when you have gone toe-to-toe with these things, and not only survived, but carried the day over and over and over again, every victory they have reduces that threat and makes it into just another thing on the board. Which is why I'm going to recommend very strongly, if you, as a storyteller, want to reach into that box of very big guns, the thing that your players are supposed to be afraid of, the thing that's supposed to be the very big bad for your particular sphere of the world of Chronicles of Darkness, don't do it often. Don't do it without putting a lot of thought into it, and do not do it without a lot of build up and lead up. Yeah, as an example, if you wanted to have a True Fae plot, don't just toss a True Fae down on the table. Build them up. Give players little snippets of their legend. Let us see their minions. Let us see the things they have done. Let us show other changelings that they have barely escaped their world, and just build up that myth. As you do that, it will legitimize this creature as a threat. It will carry that reputation into the game. It will create that tension that you need for a really big bad. Most importantly, and you can apply this to a lot of the different big bads that we have in the world in Chronicles of Darkness, not all of them, but a lot of them, is that it shouldn't be a foregone conclusion that your players are going to have to fight and kill this thing. Going back to the True Fae, is it possible that that's one of the options your players take, that they want to just acquire Cold Iron and have a big knockdown, drag-out brawl with the Lord of the Flies and just liberate everyone under his control? That's an option. You could do that if that's the sort of plot your table wants, if that's the sort of plot you want to run, if that's what your table's going to find satisfying. Absolutely do that. But that shouldn't be the foregone conclusion that you have that your players are faced with. As an example, you might feel the need to cut a deal. Every now and again, it's better the devil you know. Maybe there are other True Fae vying for his position. Maybe he offers a favor. Maybe there's something else he wants you to do to maintain a peace accord. That can also be a very interesting back and forth. Are your players willing to sell a little bit of their soul if it means that they and theirs can be safe? Are they going to question too much what it is this creature wants of them and the possible ramifications? That can also lead to a lot of fun plot developments, a lot of tension, a lot of interesting compromising of morals that I think is one of the biggest factors of a World of Chronicles of Darkness game. And you see a similar thing with Seers of the Throne of, do you want to see things from their perspective for a moment? Is there something going on that you actually agree with them that mages of both sides should be working on? If you're running a vampire game, do you attempt to use diplomacy with an awakened elder? Do you try to control or at least direct this ancient force? Do you try and figure out a place you can go where you're not in its way, and so you can maintain your unlife a little bit longer without having to directly deal with this threat, and sort of kick it down the road a little bit, maybe hoping that something alters or changes the game board so that it's not just your problem, just your decision. At the end of the day, though, you can really only get away with using these really big threats a handful of times on the same players. No matter what you do, if people have experienced a thing, if they've survived it once, they may not be as eager to show up for a sequel. Probably the best way to think about this, since I've made comparisons to the MCU before, is think about what happens when you introduce a villain in a superhero film. Thanos is probably a great example of, he was built up over several films. When he finally showed up, he was a big deal. He was wrecking things left and right. It required big, epic, cinematic music. All the allies had to come together. You had to build all of the plots, tie off all the loose ends in order to deal with him. And now he's done. If you try to build that threat back up, or try to build up another threat that's just a palette-swapped version, people who've already seen that plot, people who've already gone through those epic moments, they're going to have that entire back catalog of moments that they're going to be comparing it to, that they're going to be looking at. And a lot of the time, it won't measure up. And even if it does measure up, it's not as new, it's not as fresh, it's more of the same. Which is why it's a good idea to vary your plots, vary your enemies, figure out all the different things you can do for your players to keep them on their toes, and so that nothing gets predictable, and so that they're not going into the game automatically thinking, well, we're playing this sphere, I know this is the major villain we're going to have to deal with, so I had better start preparing myself for that now, so when we get to the final confrontation, I have all the tools and skills and abilities that I need. If someone is showing up to Werewolf and they're already assuming we're going to fight major spirits, we're going to fight the worm itself, that is going to color their judgment. It's going to make them make certain assumptions about the game, and it can lead to a lot of issues, especially if that's not the plot that you're taking them down, if that's not what it is you're going to have them doing. So, just as you had to choose the scale of your game, as I mentioned in the previous video, also make sure that you're not automatically reaching for the big threats that exist in your game. Because just because they're there, that doesn't mean that has to be your end game or that has to be a major factor of what you're doing. If you're running a Changeling game and you don't want the True Fae to be involved at all, or if you want them there, you want them as sort of background players, you want them as the weather or the environment of your game. They're very dangerous, but you're not here to fight a hurricane or to deal with a tropical storm. You're here for all of the other plots. Keep that in mind as well, of just because a major antagonist or a major threat exists in your game, that doesn't mean it has to be front and center. It doesn't have to be the thing your Chronicle is about confronting, or it has to be the problem that your players were assembled to deal with. And oftentimes we fall into that just as much as our players do, of we assume that because we were given these big bads, that's what the game has to be about. And that's not the case unless you want it to be. So that's my advice for this week. If there's, as always, a particular part of the game or a particular part of the setting you feel needs more attention, or a question you had, or something that you feel needs to be addressed in future videos, let me know in the comments down below. And for this week, I have a question for everyone who is watching. Did you run a game where you did not dip into the big bucket of expected antagonists? And how did that go when it came to your players' reaction? Did they feel they'd been cheated because they didn't get the expected confrontations with the expected creatures or antagonists they wanted? Or did they find it refreshing that they didn't know what to expect, they didn't know what was coming? But until next time, happy gaming, everyone. Thank you for staying to the end of this episode of Discussions of Darkness. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking the video and sharing it on your own social media to help boost the signal. And if you'd like to help us keep the show and channel going, don't forget to hit that subscribe button as well. If you have any questions about the topic I covered today, or if you have something you'd like to see covered in a future episode, make sure to leave it in the comments below. Lastly, please check out the link in the video description to browse all of my World and Chronicles of Darkness supplements from Azukail Games. So far, we've covered Changeling the Lost, Vampire the Masquerade, Mage the Awakening, and Geist the Sin Eaters, in addition to a handful of general supplements that will be useful for any game set in the World or Chronicles of Darkness settings. Thank you in advance for your support. You're the ones who help us keep the lights on, so we don't fade into the shadows.